Okay. Final Fantasy Ultimate Raids versus WoW Mythic Raids, comparing hardest content. All right, so we'll look at this and hear the whole perspective before really giving a big take on it. But you guys know how I feel about this. In fact, I find this question causes a lot of cringe in chat because people start just throwing shit out they don't understand, and people start like defending in quotes their game and shit. It's always really weird. Either way, it's a fascinating question, and that's one of the reasons I'm playing, or initially started playing Final Fantasy. Now I'm playing it because the game fucking owns, but like initially when I started playing it, I wanted to know the differences in the games. I did the same thing with WildStar. I've done the same thing with other games. Now, keep in mind, I have a very unique perspective. I'm trying to compare what it's like to raid World First in WoW and to raid World First in Final Fantasy. The cool thing about Final Fantasy is I and everyone else can go into Final Fantasy, and for the Ultimate and Savage content, at least of this expansion, it's a little weird with scaling with previous expansions, you can get very close to or the exact scenario of progressing what it would have been like for World First by being blind and having the gear they had at the time. In WoW, it's impossible to do that. But for me, with the way that Final Fantasy is designed, I can actually do that, which is cool. But it's really only for my knowledge, right? I am doing it from World First to World First. I have no, and what's more relatable to more people would be, what's it like to casually raid in WoW versus casually raid in Final Fantasy? I don't know the answer to that because I don't do both. But what I do know is the comparison I'm trying to make is pretty much only known by very few people, right? You'd have to be able to do World First level stuff in both games, which to this moment has not been done. We're going to do soon. In WoW, it would be impossible to know what it's like or to compare them at a World First level if you don't raid at that level. I mean, unfortunate, and I think this is unfortunate, and I wish more people had the opportunity to see it, but like killing a WoW Mythic end boss, right? The hardest thing in WoW in week 4 or week 5 is closer to heroic difficulty than it was in the first or second week for World First. That's how far off in difficulty it actually was from how it was initially. So like actually so few players actually know how difficult WoW it is. So when I hear people be like, well, I think this is more difficult. If someone is doing ultimate content in Final Fantasy and they're comparing that ultimate boss, which you can't overgear, if they're comparing that to their experience doing WoW Mythic raiding, but they're doing it 5 weeks later, they have no fucking clue how hard a WoW Mythic end boss is because they've just literally haven't seen it. Right? So that's always something to keep in mind when you're talking comparisons, is that if you're not talking to someone that's actually killed a boss in week 1 or 2, which is very few people, they're basically comparing two different things. Because Final Fantasy is designed so well that you're able... Ultimate never gets easier with gear, which is the hardest version in that game. Like, I've already done a graph showing you the time it takes for World First to kill things in WoW and World First to kill things in Final Fantasy, and I've shown, like, the difference for that. I can do that again later if you guys are interested, but just always knowing things like this, that's my mindset going in, is that you have to understand people's takes and, like, you have to understand where they're coming from and why, right? Let's get it.
WoW Mythic raiding versus
Here we go.
Final Fantasy XIV Ultimate Raids. This is a video you have been asking for many times now, but I wanted to refrain from commenting on this.
And let it be known, I plan on making one of these videos. I paused 4 seconds in. Let it be known, I plan on making one of these videos as well, but I haven't done it yet because I don't have the information. I don't like saying things I don't fully understand. Like, people ask me questions a lot, and I'll give you my opinion, but it's my opinion. I do not have an opinion on the difficulty between them both because I haven't done ultimate content blind in this game. And in my opinion, I should not comment or really give much of a take at all or make a video about this unless I have done both of those things, because I have no clue, right? So I do plan on doing this because I find the answer to this fascinating. I just haven't done it yet because I haven't done the hardest content in both games, right?
Until I actually get a clear on an ultimate raid in Final Fantasy XIV. And since Ultimate Weapon is finally in the bag, it's time to compare FF14's Ultimates versus Mythic Raiding in World of Warcraft.
Oh, wait. Shit, this might be spoilery. No, the only thing this would be spoilery on is E12. I don't give a shit about being spoiled on T or any of the Ultimates, really, because I'm not going to do those blind. Okay, cool.
The tone Mythic Raids in WoW are the hardest form of content, similar to Ultimate.
Or I can just do this, right? Paint. If he ever does some weird shit, I'll just Alt-Tab so I can only see his face and not the content. Strats.
Ultimate Raids in Final Fantasy XIV, The first point I'd like to discuss is the size of the raid roster. And I know
There's no E12 spoilers because this came out in Stormblood. This came out yesterday, so that's not true.
you are perplexed. Raid roster, out of so many things different about them, why do you choose to start with such a boring topic? But trust me, this is single-handedly the most important difference in my opinion. Whilst Mythic raids are designed for 20-man raids, Final Fantasy Ultimates are designed for 8-man raids. And what happens in Final Fantasy statics is that when one player can't make a night of raid, well, you can likely find a makeup raid or another night amongst the 7 other raiders. A smaller group allows for more flex around timing, and as such, in Final Fantasy, you never hear of running a bench. There are groups that turn to friends for substitutes.
Okay. I mean, first of all, he's exactly right. If you want to talk about the differences in WoW Mythic raids and Final Fantasy raids, 100% I need to turn this up, by the way. 100% absolutely. The biggest difference by far is the amount of players, and that leads into so many specific differences.
But you never run a dedicated bench unlike World of Warcraft. Now, in WoW, every single competitive Mythic guild has a deep bench, and this
Correct.
is typically around a total roster size of 25 to 26 people, so 5 to 6 people on their bench. And why is that so? Let's imagine you run a strict 20-man roster with no bench. And if someone has a real-life emergency, for example, when his or her goldfish is drowning,
I saw
or
that.
it's
I
their
saw that
pet
nasty
dog's
weave he just
birthday,
did.
you literally have caused 19 other people to waste their raid night because the fight is just not doable with only 19 people. It is also very challenging to find a makeup raid night for 19 people due to scheduling conflicts. Also, in World of Warcraft...
So he's saying that... Well, he's saying that it's like easy to get a sub in Final Fantasy, but I feel like he's making the same point for both. Like in WoW, if a player can't be there that night, you have people on the bench, so you still raid. But he's saying Final Fantasy statics, if you guys are unaware, usually have 8 people exactly. You do not even have a 9th person. The top world guilds have an outside the raid leader person or just a sub, right? In case like someone's internet comes out, I guess. But it's typically exactly 8. So he's saying like in a cat, and also this is kind of indicative to where he's going to be going. He's talking about, I believe, the mid-level or casual level rating in both games. He's not talking about hardcore rating, I think. Not like at least he's not talking about the very, very high end, right? So it's actually going to be cool to see a different perspective that I would have, right? But yeah, so he's saying it's pretty easy to find a sub for Final Fantasy because there's just people looking for groups, I guess.
It's very hard to find substitutes at the last minute, simply because if, let's say, after the weekly reset, I've already taken part in a Mythic raid in some shape or form, and I've only killed one boss, let's say boss A, I essentially have bound my character to that Mythic raid lockout for the rest of the week.
Very good
so
point.
Even if my friend asked me to go into another raid instance to kill boss B, which I've never done in my raid lockout, I'm unable to even zone into the same instance as their raid group. This is why running a bench is so important. So in WoW, typically people run a bench of 5 to 6 people because chances of more than one person not making a raid for a specific night is actually quite likely. And because of the need to run a bench, my sense is there's more roster drama in WoW than Final Fantasy, especially at endgame raiding.
Absolutely.
Because the difficult conversation of having to tell 4 to 5 people you are sitting out on this brand new fight feels bad. And trust me, nobody likes sitting on the bench and watching other people do the fight
100%.
while you twiddle your thumbs and draw circles on the ground. Those people are constantly on the lookout for a more long-term guaranteed starting spot in another roster. And because of the need to run a bench, WoW's roster boss problem is way harder than Final Fantasy stats.
I'm just going to stop it right there. He's 100% right. Having the exact amount of people that'll be there is so much better for that. Like, and people wonder why people complain about that. They're like, man, this guy doesn't like sitting. Hey, no one likes fucking sitting. There are people in my guild. It's pretty rare in my guild because obviously we have like an ultimate goal that's different than just like playing the game and having fun, even though that's still the primary objective. Where obviously no one wants to sit. You want to be in and play the game. I've never understood people complaining about people being upset about sitting. Like, think about it. If you raid like 2 or 3 days in a WoW guild, right, a week or something or less, and you're constantly sitting, why the fuck would you stay in that guild? You play the game to have fun. Unless you know those people really well and you're like boys, you just go back, right? The reason people care about loot is because one of the fundamental fun things about RPGs is to make your character stronger possible. Like, obviously, some people are way more greedy with that than others, and like it's a team dynamic, right? But that mentality makes sense. Obviously, I'm not ever exposed to this. I'm just trying to use logic, right? And like in WoW, But wanting to play in raids makes sense. Why are you in a raid guild? To fucking raid. If you're not raiding, you're not having fun. If you're not playing the game, how can you have fun, right? So it absolutely makes sense. The thing is that with a 20-person raid size, it is very necessary to do that. But he did touch on a point that Final Fantasy does that I think is fucking brilliant. You don't get locked to the ability to do the content. You get locked to the ability to loot the gear twice in 1 week until they obviously unlock it later in the expansion where you can spam it for gear, right? That's something I think WoW should do, and that would make running a raid size smaller much easier. Because like what he's saying, if you guys are unfamiliar in WoW, if you've killed the first boss in a raid, so we'll use a Final Fantasy as an example, and you've killed, for the week of farm, you killed a Ramoot, for example, in E5S, Eden's, not Promise, not Gate, the other one, Verse, Eden's Verse, okay? And then people are looking for E7S progress, or your friend is. You can't fill into them because in another group you killed E5. Or in some cases, you only pulled E6. You didn't even kill a boss. You just got locked to a lockout. I think lockouts might be a little bit outdated. I think loot lockouts are good. Keep in mind, WoW already does this for Heroic. The system already exists in the game for Heroic. If you've killed all of Heroic, you can still run Heroic over and over and over again. You just aren't eligible on the loot table or can get loot. So I think he touches on an important point that I wish he would have elaborated even more on. I think WoW should absolutely allow you to keep raiding Mythic after you've cleared, right? Like, think about all the parse parties people do in Final Fantasy, right? Where, like, people just, like, chain pull a boss and kill it and try to get better parses. You literally can't do that in WoW. If you kill a boss for the hardest boss of that, like, content, you can only pull it one time a week, right? So you can't do that. Now, I asked Now this question, and I thought it was really interesting. And we were like, if you could do that in WoW, could you see players in Limit or Echo just spamming bosses for parses? And the answer was universally no. But I think guilds under us would absolutely fucking do that because people like it. And it's fun to, like, outdo yourself, set goals, stuff like that. As long as you're not a weirdo who attributes any kind of skill to your parse ranking, that would be weird. But it is fun to do. That's why people parse. It's a way to better yourself. It's a way to outdo a personal best. People like that stuff. It's natural. Really, really, really good points so far. And I think it's important that when I started this video, I mentioned how this perspective would certainly differ from mine. Right? Just to reiterate in very, very short. When I'm looking at the game, I'm looking at the very highest levels, and I'm trying to look at it in both levels. What I hate is when people look at it from a casual perspective in WoW and compare it to an Ultimate. Because like I said, Ultimates, World First Time, and WoW Mythic End Boss, like the End Boss that's there, just the End Boss alone, not the whole raid. The time to kill those bosses is almost identical over the past 3 years. However, that's only for the world first kill. They die much, much faster later on because the bosses are infinitely easier in WoW week to week where you cannot outgear an Ultimate. So he's so far giving a very good perspective and I appreciate a very different perspective from me because I'm looking at the game obviously through a different lens. And this is probably the lens that would be more relatable to more people.
Tactics' problem. You have a higher turnover in WoW rosters, and recruiting players is actually something that top Mythic guilds have to constantly do throughout the entire tier. Clique dramas within a 20-man roster is common, where one person in a group of close friends is not picked for a fight. The other 3 to 4 members of his clique is 100%. Disgruntled, and they might all end up leaving together as a group. In which case, the raid leader is left with a gaping hole of 4 to 5 people, and the raid leader needs to bring in replacement, which does take time.
In WoW, free Final Fantasy players, sometimes guilds are forced to accept package deals. Let you know right now, huge fucking trap. Because if they're both not really good and raid all the time, gonna have problems. The most famous version of this is husband and wives. Proceed with caution. However, you know, it makes sense. If you put 20... Cliques is a negative term. When you say there's a clique, that is viewed with a negative idea, right? I actually don't think it's very negative. And the reason why is because it's well, it can be, certainly. You can have toxic friend groups. When you put 20 plus people together that have to interact on a close basis, there are going to be people who relate to other people within that group and become good friends and have friend groups. There is no guild on earth of 20 people that does not have people that spend more time with other people than others. It's fucking human nature, right? It's just a friend group. Now, how that friend group reacts to the group, you know, obviously they're like sticking up for one of their friends who's not getting raid time. It can create problems for sure. It's probably one of the hidden downsides of having more people in a raid.
Time. I'm sure there's drama in Final Fantasy statics too, but I would guess.
Wait,
that
what did
it's
you guys
to a
say?
less-
Hold up. Oh God, 2 people in Final Fantasy with the same last name. Oh no, what does that mean? Oh, is that a thing in Final Fantasy 2? I bet it could be, because like obviously in WoW, if you have a package deal of 2 people, they're 10% of your raid or less because you have run a bench. In Final Fantasy, if you have a package deal, 2 people at a time, same last name, at the very least, they are 25% of your raid group, which is a much bigger investment. So same last name, Paladin and White Mage. Oh, this is actually a thing, huh? Okay. You should watch Arthar's same last name clip. Yo, can we talk about Arthar's for a second? Just quick caveat. Let me scroll my Twitter timeline for a second. All I'm saying is, here, hold up, chat. When I see this on my Twitter, when I see this, I know what the fuck is coming after it. Okay? I know exactly what's under this picture right here. Every time I see it every day. Love Arthar's, but man, it's just like, dude, sometimes Arthar's just tweets the craziest shit. Like, let me see if I can find some of it. I'm not kidding. I actually bust out laughing alone when I see this shit. Like, where is this shit? Jesus Christ, Arthar's. This is like 5 times a day. This, he tweets shit like this. It's so funny. Wait, did I miss it? No, I didn't miss it. It was a few days ago. He just rips wild tweets, man. This. It's so funny, dude. It's just like, dude, how are you this bricked up on Twitter, man? It gets me every time. Oh my God. This Okay, holy fuck. He's just fucking horny on Twitter, dude. All right, back to the video. Slight caveat,
degree.
my bad.
Another thing I've noticed about raiding in a 8-people cell versus a 20-man group is that the banter is way better in a smaller group. Just imagine sitting in a circle with 8 people versus 20 people. Naturally, the conversation flows better within 8 people due to less talking
I don't
over
even
one
remember what this
another.
guy was talking about.
And also within a smaller group of 8, chances of you having everyone being close friends and on the same social wavelength is definitely higher than trying to form a roster around, 20 close friends in World of Warcraft. Now, I'd like to move on to talk about the importance of specs and classes in WoW.
This is a very big
versus
point.
Jobs in Final Fantasy.
Hopefully he nails
And
this.
this is where they differ as well. I feel in World of Warcraft, cutting-edge mythic raid teams have a way stronger emphasis on bringing the right specs and classes.
Absolutely.
Final Fantasy does have it to a certain degree, but I'm told most of the community subscribes to bringing the player over actual jobs. But let me elaborate. I'll start with Final Fantasy first.
Let me.
There are definitely benefits to...
But actually, okay. This is something that a lot of WoW players get fucking wrong. Because the reality is, because WoW has double the specs, and because WoW specs are way less homogenized than they are in Final Fantasy, you do run into situations where bosses, and also, just as important, bosses are way more different in WoW than Final Fantasy. Like, just on a boss-to-boss basis, the type of damage you do is just so fucking different that it just naturally creates situations where classes are better than others for sure. And again, there's double the amount of jobs / specs, right? If jobs and specs are the same thing. But I will say that's something the WoW community fundamentally misunderstands. That is true for sometimes week 1. As soon as you get the first lockout of gear, for the last 5 years, your comp does not fucking matter. It doesn't matter at all. But the WoW community certainly fucking thinks it does. And it didn't used to be like this. I really think it was like the Race World First and the MDI like made it this way. Because I promise you, back in WoD, back in MoP, no one ever was like, oh no, we can't have a Feral Druid in our team. We need to have a Fire Mage. Like no one ever did that. The game is, and by the way, the game is more balanced right now than it ever was in WoD and MoP. So it's just like, and maybe some of it isn't WoW gaming. Maybe in general, gamers became more meta-gamey in like 2021 than they were in 2015. That's absolutely possible. Tier list wasn't the top result on YouTube when you typed that in 2015. So, and it is now. So I think that's probably a big part of it, but yeah.
Optimizing your statics comp. For example, bringing a raid mage for combat res is optimal as the job brings the lowest downside or loss in output to res a fallen ally. In the main tank position, I think a warrior is also traditionally preferred as the main tank due to lower invulnerability cooldowns as well as higher self-sustain. These benefits are good to have as a job, but they are not going to offer a superior advantage where the fight becomes way easier just because you have the meta or optimal comp. The consensus generally is to bring the player that is more comfortable on whatever he's best on in terms of jobs, rather than...
And that's what you do in Final Fantasy. That's what you should do in WoW too. Even at a world first level, I think one of the biggest reasons we underperformed this raid was because we were too confident in our skill parity in our guild, and we tried to bring in just the best perfect comp for everything instead of making sure that every single one of our best overall players was in every fight. So even at a world first level, Echo and Limit would tell you that player skill and having people play what they're comfortable on is still a paramount for us. You should put your best 20 players in the raid pretty much regardless of comp in every WoW guild. Straight up. It's just better. People do not think that way. You're thinking way too much about classes. Always play your best players.
And force them to play a job they're not familiar with. Now let's compare this to World of Warcraft, where I think spec and class optimization is way more important. In World of Warcraft, you have certain classes in the roster that are a must bring if you are serious about mythic raiding. You need to bring at least one demon hunter for a passive buff they bring to the raid.
He's talking about raid buffs, yes.
Brand, and it
raid buffs are dog
the
shit.
Magical damage done by the entire roster by 5% on the boss. Yes, 5%. Not just to you, but to the entire raid as a buff. Likewise, you like to bring one monk.
Yeah, raid buffs are dog shit.
A similar passive buff to the raid called Mystic.
I thought he was going to say like a few classes are required, meaning like this class because of this crazy thing. He's going to talk about the classes that are literally required to bring. But there are differences there, but it's weird because like in WoW, if you have a 20-man raid, right? About 6 of those spots are required for raid buffs, right? You have a Paladin for 3% passive DR, Priest for Fort buff, Mage for Arcane Intellect, Warrior for Battle Shout, Monk and Demon Hunter for Monk and Demon Hunter for debuffs, and 7 Warlock for Warlocks, because Warlocks have irreplaceable utility, summons, Hellstones, stuff like that. So it's like 7 of the 20, and then you have 13 classes, but the difference is those 13 classes can be whatever, and they can be stacked, where in Final Fantasy, yes, there's less unique things that every class brings, just in general, from a spec to job basis, but you don't class stack, so in a way, you have to bring different things. So it's like there's negatives to both, but believe me, I'll be the first person to tell you that raid buffs basically guaranteeing a raid spot for some classes arbitrarily is obviously terrible. It's dog shit.
It grants an additional 5% physical damage dealt by the raid roster on the boss. You need at least one mage, hunter, or shaman to bring Bloodlust, a massive DPS buff granting 30% haste for 40 seconds in the fight. You need at least one priest to bring the fortitude buff that increases stamina and health pool of the group. You need one mage to buff your intellect of the raid roster, aiding the DPS of casters.
Sound busted?
You want to bring at least one warlock so you can get additional health stones.
Right, because the content's designed around having it. Like that's what I hate about it. Like, oh yeah, well it's busted because monks bring a 5% physical damage increase debuff and demon hunters bring a 5% magical damage increase debuff. Okay, you know what they do? Very simple. Those two things exist in the game for what reason exactly? And you know how Blizzard balanced around it? Okay, give every boss 5% and everything 5% more health. You know how you get rid of it? Get rid of both of those debuffs, give everything 5% less health. Over. It's gone. Exact. It's fixed instantly. It's not hard, right? It's just a fucking 5%. It's basic as fuck, right?
Edge fight. And a free warlock gateway that allows you to teleport across moderate distances in the fight. And for a while, those are the general principles when it comes to building the roster. There are very specific fights that give you a massive advantage by bringing certain classes or progression. Is it possible to do without these classes? Sure, but I'm arguing that it gives a way larger advantage by bringing meta specs for Mythic Raid versus the meta jobs for Final Fantasy Ultimates.
Yes.
Not convinced? I'll give you 2 analogies.
He's exactly right. Relative to Final Fantasy, it's a much bigger deal. Relative to how important WoW Raiders think it is, very fucking wrong.
On Mythic Ashvane, a boss from the Eternal Palace, during the race to World First, the meta strat was to bring 3 tanks. Yes, 3 tanks, you heard it right. With 1 tank being very specifically a prot paladin. And the reason so is because the sole...
You could do it as 3 of the 6 tank classes.
The job of the protection paladin is to soak up bubbles that will spawn in the room, which deals a massive amount of damage to a single player, Whenever
You could also 2-tank and do this exact strat.
they soak the bubbles because of a stacking debuff that will result on your character every time you pop a single bubble. A Protection Paladin is the only spec with 2 magical immunities, a Divine Shield and Spell Warding that can allow them to take no damage from popping the bubbles. Now, in the World First race, the Prot Paladin tank is mostly dead on the ground for most of the fight, except for 2 parts of the fight where he needs to be alive or combat rest, so he can go around with movement speed buffs, popping the bubbles with his immunities to magical damage, allowing the raid to
This is like the most
mechanic outright.
This was like the most WoW strat of all time. So what he's referring to, do you guys see these little bubbles in everyone's raid frames? That's the stacking dot they have from soaking one singular bubble. So the strat he's talking about for World First was you brought a 3rd tank and you dropped a healer, because this is like really hard to have that raid damage spread out over your whole raid, right? So the idea was you soaked like the first one as a group, and then the Paladin actually, through immunities, soaked every single bubble in the fight. So a World First, I mean, I can literally show you here. Let me find our kill. Oh, there it is. Okay, here it is. So look at his raid frames. Okay, bubbles on everyone. This is how it was done for World First. Look at Bubblerific dead with 17 stacks here. And then we're going to the next thing. We're about to get more. He gets rezzed right now. He's waiting to take it. He has a pending battle res. That's what that thing is. He takes it. He's going to take it pretty soon as these bubbles come in, or the next set of bubbles. This is so fucking good. Yeah, he's waiting. He's waiting for the server tick of the dots. Yeah. Right here. He rezzes bubbles so he doesn't take any damage, and he sprints around with like a sky step potion, and he soaks all the bubbles for us. And then as soon as this thing's over, he fucking dies again. and then he's gone. He's done his job. And then he does it later too. He does it again, right? I think at this point we might actually just burn. At this point we just kill it, yeah. But that's the idea.
So it's the most effective way of doing the fight. Which
WoW strats for sure. Yeah, I mean, you have more options to do things like that in a 20-man raid. You can be like, is it possible to kill this way? Yes, but it's harder. A lot of the times it's thinking of the most easy, repeatable thing and seeing if you have the damage and then changing it. It's the same philosophy in Final Fantasy, by the way. Why you see a lot of downtime strats on progression. It's because there's no reason to spend time optimizing for uptime strats if you know you don't need it to kill the boss.
At a very tight DPS check mathematically during the race to World First. No other class or spec can replace the effectiveness of a Prot Paladin tank when it comes to
You could have done that on a few different tanks.
being immune to magical damage. Not convinced? Need another example? In the very same tier, Queen Azshara, the final boss of Eternal Palace,
What is he
boss
going to
that
say?
grants the coveted cutting edge title, has a mechanic where 3 players need to stand line of sight from the raid to be dispelled of a debuff. And when the debuff is purged, any allies
Master Spell.
in the line of
He's going
sight
to talk about
will take
Master Spell.
unwanted damage. The most efficient way to do this is actually to have warlocks in your party because they have a pet called an imp, which can be manually positioned in anywhere in the room.
Yeah,
and
this is, I feel like, definitely a reach. Warlock Dispel actually caused a lot of problems for guilds because their Warlock players, like most, are just meatheads that just hit the boss and don't summon anyone or do any mechanics. And they were requiring them to pet dispel someone on an important end boss for the first time ever, and it caused them to constantly fuck it up, and you wiped. I would say 95% of guilds who tried to do this, which was clearly optimal for World First, would have actually... Okay, you guys have ads. Fuck, I'll wait. Okay, so what I was saying is, he's saying Warlock Dispels is what was so broken on this, because you could just have an imp dispel it, not take any damage from it. Okay, here's how this worked, guys. Look at this. Look at this person right here. When you dispelled them, it did raid damage to everyone around you. If it ever went off in progression and hit everyone, you would die. Okay, so this person had to be healer dispelled right here, LOS of everyone
will be positioned
right now.
near the desert.
He gets dispelled right now. And then you see how this animation goes off of his character. If anyone is in line of sight of that, they die. So what you did is you had Warlocks dispel it. However, it did not do enough damage to actually kill you. And I promise you, if healers just simply had a dispel rotation, meaning healer 1 dispels person 1, healer 2, person 2, healer 3, person 3, and they move out in LOS of them and dispel them, and both of them go to like 60% health, it would have worked just fine. And guilds would have killed it faster than their warlocks, who frequently don't do mechanics and just meathead hit the boss, mess it up every pull and wipe to no dispel, than just having healers do it. Or having mass dispels. Common common misconception among guilds is trying to copy what World First guilds did and not doing the practical thing that's easier to kill the fight.
Debuff players, so that when they are hiding line of sight behind a structure, the imp can dispel their debuff while the rest of the raid stays safe out of line of sight. And ask anyone progging the boss. This is insanely hard to do if you have no warlocks in the raid, because the debuff have a timer to expiring. If you don't do it quickly enough, you run into bigger problems. The point I'm trying to make is that Final Fantasy does give you the benefit in optimizing your roster comp, but it does not put you as big of a disadvantage versus a similar scenario in World of Warcraft.
That is
you
true.
Choose to bring a sub.
It is definitely less in Final Fantasy, but I just cannot point out enough how much it is massively misunderstood in WoW.
The more comp. The third main point I'd like to talk about is the innovation of raid mechanics and complexity in resolving the mechanics. And I'd like to say up front, I think both WoW and Final Fantasy XIV, they are actually equally capable of designing really innovative and engaging fight mechanics. Both are equally capable of designing fun mechanics that makes the boss really engaging. Quick examples. Before
we talked about this with Sophia the other day.
I've never seen a raid mechanic like suppression before, where you have multiple combinations of mini bosses doing their own unique ability that needs to be resolved simultaneously. In World of Warcraft, I'm sure many of you can also name memorable boss fights that was, the hardest boss encounters of its era. Yogg-Saron One Light comes to mind. The Lich King fight was pretty epic as well. And more recently, Sire Denatrius and Castle Natria was deemed to be a cool fight by many in the Shadowlands because of the mirror mechanic, where the secret phase of the boss mechanics are actually reversed. And to be more specific, in one dimension of the fight, when the boss does a knockback, players naturally get knocked back. But if you enter another dimension through another mirror, the knockbacks actually pull you to the boss. So everything else is in reverse and you need to learn the fight in reverse. There are many other good examples, but I think fight and mechanic designs in terms of...
And if you ever touched someone from the non-mirror phase, you both instantly died.
Innovation and design is brilliant on both.
I'm telling you, man, Sire is underrated, but it's not random, right? Like, people have huge recency bias. In general, the public opinion of pretty much anything in WoW, you should completely ignore it until almost years after the fact, because of just how insanely negative everyone is about everything in the moment. To just being completely honest with you, like, you will not have an accurate opinion about something usually until you're like looking back on it. Sire, very fucking good boss, and one of the things it did is it actually maintained difficulty. A lot of fights that happen in WoW, world first kill is like 130 pulls, and then or 150, 180, 200, 250, 300, and then kills after that are way lower, even though the guilds aren't as good, because just gear makes it a joke. But Sire Denathrius stayed a challenging fight the entire time, primarily because dodging Massacre kills you with full gear and low gear. That's the barrier. If you look at your Sire Denathrius progression, certainly you're learning progression. You're learning the progression of the fight. It's so hard to keep seeing it consistently with everyone alive to get real practice, because people just die to Massacre. It's hard. Castle Nathria is a better raid than Sanctum. Oh, that's not a hot take. Sanctum is one of the worst raids they've ever made. Yeah, that is. Had so much potential too. But yeah, Castle Nathria was great for so many reasons, and Sanctum is not good. That's not what this is about.
Sides of World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV. There's just no clear winner in this department. Both have made bosses that are stellar, so there's no strong distinction here. The difference comes when it's about resolving your mechanics. Like I covered extensively in another video, WoW always had the benefits of add-ons and weak auras. Think of this as CACbot for WoW, except it can be programmed to do very pretty nutty stuff, including resolving mechanics. Okay, let's see where he goes here. For example, if I get this combination of debuff, I should be moving to marker X. People who did Queen Azshara intermission will know what I'm talking about. Or it can even send you text alerts on which marker you should be moving to at which exact second of the fight. But since you like examples, here you go. In this fight for Queen Azshara, you will be randomly assigned debuffs. And depending on your combination of debuffs, you need to go to a very specific marker and do specific things to resolve the mechanics. This includes stacking with other players, staying still and not moving, being alone, staying away from other players, or constantly moving, or soaking orbs. And as you can see from the text on my screen, it actually tells me which marker I should go to perform my actions. That is the power of using external add-ons and weak auras to resolve mechanics in World of Warcraft. But you get the point. In WoW, weak auras and mythic raiding for cutting edge content is basically mandatory. World First racing teams have dedicated weak aura makers that they bring to World First races during launch weeks. So while the innovation and complexity of mechanics are comparable
Shout out.
across both games, World of Warcraft does allow you to rely on external add-ons to solve them much.
Okay, this is where I don't think he's going to get there. I was giving him the opportunity to. Because these have been in the game for a long time, these things have basically become required, especially by the general public. There's sometimes World First guilds outplay it. Like I remember people saying Star Augur was basically required to have an add-on. We killed Star Augur World Top 5 before we started going for World First. We killed that boss without an add-on before it was nerfed. And in bosses like Azshara that he used, I know a lot about the strat where I know a lot about this strat where these weak auras are made. You want to know why? Because I made it. This weak aura is made off of what I came up with for this fight. Okay? Before we had weak auras made for it, because we didn't have a dedicated weak aura person back then, we did it by just understanding where you're supposed to go with stuff like that. It's possible to do without it, but it's fucking insanely hard. Here's my point. If weak auras were never made in WoW, if weak auras were not allowed, if there was no add-ons, you would not see mechanics this difficult in WoW. The game has elevated and created more complex mechanics because weak auras exist. And that's obvious because it existed. The exact same thing would happen in Final Fantasy too. If they allowed add-ons, which by the way, I encourage you to never use add-ons in Final Fantasy. Why? Because the game doesn't allow them and they design their content to always be done without them. That's why I really, really urge you to never use that because it's going to take away your experience a lot. That game is designed for, the complexity is different. The game is designed to challenge you by learning and memorizing and seeing things in a fight. Timers very negatively affect Final Fantasy. Where in WoW, it's been this way for so long that it's required, but that doesn't diminish the difficulty of the content. Like I said, I've already shown you the difference in how long it takes World First to do all this stuff, right? It's a very non-WoW player thing to be like, oh, well, what do you mean? They just have stuff that tells them what to do. Like, there's a reason it's mandatory because the content basically requires it. And even with all of that information, it's still really fucking hard, right? And that's obviously not the point he's making. I'm kind of just making it to a broader audience, but let's see where he finishes.
Being still and not moving, being alone, staying away from other players, or constantly moving, or soaking orbs. And as you can see from the text on my screen, it actually tells me which marker I should go to perform my actions. That is the power of using external add-ons and weak auras to resolve mechanics in World of Warcraft. But you get the point. In WoW, weak auras and mythic raiding for cutting edge content is basically mandatory. World First racing teams have dedicated weak aura makers that they bring to World First races during launch weeks. So while the innovation and complexity of mechanics are comparable,
Oh, did I rewind it? I must have.
World of Warcraft does allow you to rely on external add-ons to solve them much more readily versus Final Fantasy XIV. Because keep in mind, there are tons of weak aura makers out there for WoW versus Final Fantasy, because I guess those who actually support and develop for CACbot are pretty much in minority.
Absolutely. I mean, just look at me being basically the first person to stream with full plugin, with a lot of viewers at least, full plugins, full add-ons, and embracing it and like trying to like optimize my UI in this game. And look how much in that amount of time that it's developed. Delve UI start to finish began from that happening basically. So the reason why there's a lot of people in WoW is because there's a market for it. If people are interested in it in Final Fantasy and want to become a part of it, like it or not, they would have the empowerment to do so. So the reason it's there in Final Fantasy is it's not there. Now, something you should be aware of though, and I kind of hope for Final Fantasy's sake it doesn't develop into this and Square Enix kind of does something about it. Currently, so WoW weak auras and add-ons are very misunderstood by a lot of people outside of WoW or outside of like the top world rating, because obviously we look into how much you can do. It's been heavily gated in what you can do. It's been nerfed many times when you were able to do super, super broken shit. Archimond is a great example. Star Augur is a good example. Okay. Final Fantasy, if you put some of the fucking crane brains that exist in like the weak aura space in WoW, or if Final Fantasy certainly has its own crane brains once they're feel more enabled to develop, I'm a little more scared isn't the right word, but I'm pretty sure with external plugins and add-ons in Final Fantasy that don't exist right now could be more game-breaking than a weak aura in WoW ever could. And the reason why is because it's so not regulated that there's just basically just insane shit that exists for that. They already exist. I'm sure they already exist, but I promise you they could get better. One thing I'm glad of in Final Fantasy is I'm glad that CactBot is not the norm. I mean, if people want to raid with CactBot, like, I don't give a shit. I think you're giving yourself a worse experience for sure. But I like obviously play the game you want. If you like criticize the way other people play the game, you're fucking weirdo. Just straight up. But like I definitely think it takes away from you learning the game. But like there could be so much more insane shit.
And I think it's also worth calling out that in World of Warcraft, new raids are available to be tested on public test realms. Everyone can log in to test the new raids, meaning weak aura makers can actually hop on the test realms and test the triggers for their weak auras and their codes, so that by the time the real raid actually launches on live servers, you already have well-made weak aura packs to rely on for day one of live raiding on the live servers. While in Final Fantasy, raids are released for the very first time on patch day, so I can bet stuff like CactBot doesn't even work yet. Essentially, you're doing it blind. Now, I'd like to move on to talk about visual design. Honestly speaking, visual design is a very subjective matter. World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV both have distinct looks to their visual and art style, and I don't think there's a right or wrong if you prefer one over the other. In WoW's heydays, there are...
Wait, hold up. Someone said, I'm confused why you think CactBot hurts the experience, but weak auras and DBM stuff is mandatory. Easy. Because Final Fantasy content is designed for there not to be CactBot, and WoW raids are designed for weak auras, add-ons, and DBM to be there. And have been for 5-6 years. The exact answer, without any need to explain it further.
Some amazingly beautiful room encounters and design. Algalon's room, Star Augur's room remain one of my most favorite design spaces to date, and there are many others that I'm sure you'll be able to name as well. Likewise, for Final Fantasy XIV, U-Corp, T, Ultimate Weapon, they all feature aesthetically gorgeous stages. However, where I think the raid design actually differs visually is the transition phases. Final Fantasy XIV has way more elaborate transitions in phases, usually accompanied by some astonishing visuals. Example, Tetraflare on Bahamut in U-Corp. Ultimate Weapon has the intermission where Ultima Weapon starts dismantling and eating the primals for breakfast. In World of Warcraft, the RP elements during the intermission is definitely less elaborate, and because of that, the intermission is shorter in sequence. Now, some people like short transitions, others like long transitions. I personally like seeing the eye candy during the intermission, so obviously I'm leaning towards Final Fantasy in this department.
Yeah, Final Fantasy has some baller visual shit. Like, dude, imagine the first hard boss we ever faced in Final Fantasy was Titan, and then you see the Titan intermission, you know, and you're like, what? You know, like, what the fuck is this shit? You know, all cutscenes are bad at both games. Unskippable cutscenes mid-fight, dog shit. Case closed, can't argue it. I don't make the rules, it's bad. But the like actual boss transition shit, this game looks really cool. But he sounded like the phases were more interesting. I actually don't know if I'm alone in that. I wonder what your all's opinion is who've played both games. But one of the things I do like more about WoW is that there are more types of ways to do damage. And the raid fights offer a way higher variety of types of fights, right? Like multi-target, 2-target, 3-target, AoE. Like we were looking at Ashvane earlier, right? Like right at the beginning of Ashvane, you saw at the end, people, just something like this, you know? Final Fantasy has it, it's just not as often. Like right here, Briny Bubbles. You stack these up. If anyone gets hit in this, you turn into a bubble, and there's 3 that go out. So you spread them, right? And then you... Oh, are these being killed? Oh, is this like for the kill or something? Why are they so spread? We used to stack... Oh, no, stacking them like makes you take extra AoE. But the point is like, you have to break them out in time. This exists in Final Fantasy, right? Like on breaking the healers out of the jails on E4S. Exact same thing, right? It's just a constant reoccurring thing. There's more damage checks that matter in the middle of a fight, right? Like the one we're doing right now, E12S. We haven't seen past... Don't spoil it, by the way. We haven't seen past whatever the beginning of the fight is. We're 8 minutes in. We're working on the enrage of the whatever the first boss's name is. And we obviously know it's not the end of the fight, but like there is a mid-fight DPS check of having to clearly kill her in time to see farther. That's something that exists on basically multiple times throughout every WoW fight, right? It's like that stuff like that. I know he's talking visual only, I know. Wait, why is it? Oh, I'm playing the wrong video. Shit.
Though again, I think in this category, there's no right or wrong answer here.
But Final Fantasy clearly has way more visual spectacle. Like, it's like clearly better.
Next thing I'll talk about is song and music design for...
Except you all know that I love falling through floors in WoW. So, man, if a Final Fantasy fight had all the normal bells and whistles, but then this ground just shattered and you fell to another floor that was also a circle or a square. Oh, fuck me up.
And without a hint of the doubt,
fuck me up and down.
No argument here.
There is?
Hands
Alright, I
down,
can't wait to
Final
do
Fantasy
it.
Ultimate Rating takes the cake for me here. I won't play any songs in this video for comparisons due to copyright issues, but I am 100% sure there's just no comparison in this department.
Yeah.
World of Warcraft has done some beautiful soundtracks over the years, but I would argue
Yeah, Waycrest Manor, raid music is usually pretty good. Final Fantasy's is way better. That being said, I can't do it all the time. Like, if I'm raiding in the race world first, I probably wouldn't listen to, like, the exact same song on repeat for 2 days. I'd probably listen to, like, 50 songs on repeat, you know? I love Final Fantasy's boss music, but usually only on a kill pull or on the first day. After that, it's like, you're not just going to catch me listening to the same music every single pull. That's psycho shit. But that being said, their music is clearly fucking awesome, right?
they exist
It is
outside
fucking
of raids.
awesome.
For example, the Wrath of the Lich King trailer will still go down in my heart as one of the most moving cinematics ever made. Arthas, My Son is just a absolutely great soundtrack here. Invincible is also a great soundtrack that we got from that era. And there are many zones with countless classical musical hits from the World of Warcraft genre. But when it comes to raiding, it's not a thing where World of Warcraft actually sinks in time to compose great musical tracks. That I'm confident of saying. Contrast this to Final Fantasy XIV, where just in Ultimate Raids alone, there's Answers and UCorp, there's Mobius from T, and there's the song during the Ultima phase in the Ultimate Weapon. The contest isn't even close when you talk strictly about the background music that plays when you're doing the Mythic Raids in World of Warcraft versus the Ultimate Raids in Final Fantasy XIV. The upside here, of course, is that when you're dead on the floor and watching floor POV in Final Fantasy XIV, at least you get to hear some riveting soundtracks. And the music also syncs beautifully with transitions in Final Fantasy XIV and even with certain mechanics.
Floor
something
POV.
that World of Warcraft does not do via its background music. So hands down, it's a clear win to FF14 in the song and music category in raids. There's no debate about it. This is a sword I'm willing to die on. The next thing I'd like to talk about is replayability. This is a huge distinction for Mythic Raids in World of Warcraft versus Ultimate Raids in Final Fantasy XIV.
Oh yeah.
Once the tier is no longer current content in WoW, I can assure you, you will have almost zero chance of finding a pickup group outside of your guild that is willing to go back and redo Mythic Raids the
Unless it has a mount.
way they were intended to be done. More
Oh, never the way they were intended to be done.
specifically at a certain eye level without overgearing the content. In World of Warcraft, there's just no downscaling of eye level to do a
It's dog. One of the very I've talked about this a lot, but one of the very best features Final Fantasy has is the fact that you can go and do old content even within the same expansion. You know, like Titan was like 2 years ago. You can do it and experience it very close to the way it was. That is so fucking cool. I wish WoW had that. The only thing I wish Final Fantasy would do to make it a little bit better is I think there's still a bunch of really good content, and we're actually experiencing it, not today, but maybe over the next few days. We've been doing this with like Svea and a few members of our group and going back and doing some of the old Savages, just all the raid content in order, including Ultimates. And I think it's fascinating. Like some of those fights, even back then, are like really fucking cool. I've heard they make Unreal fights, which is basically they remake and rescale those fights for current expansion. I know I'm asking a game to do something that's already doing this thing really well, but the next level of it would just make it so those things can be pulled at level 80 or max level. It really takes away from the experience to go back and do things with like 5 buttons. And I know it's a huge developmental ask, but I mean that would just be that would be fucking insane. And I wish WoW would do the same thing. Imagine if you could go back and pull Throne of Thunder with mop talents, mop class design. Like they have all that information. It would just make the game huge, right? Like that would be fucking insanely cool. You know? Like think like there's nothing to do right now in WoW. Really, after you've cleared the raid, unless you're like a Mythic Plus farmer, you like PvP, not a lot to do. Imagine if your group of friends finish the raid and you're like, you know what, man? Why don't we just take the next like month and a half, do our normal raid days? But dude, half of us didn't even raid in MOP or more. Like, you guys want to try to do like Lei Shen progression, you know? Go back and do Lei Shen progression, do Blackhand progression, see these bosses we've never seen before. But it was actually like the way it was back then. People would fucking love it, dude. People would love that shit. I don't know how many people would do it, but the ones who did would love it. So,
fight. There's no magic checkbox that you can check to downscale yourself to give yourself a challenge and a good time on the old Mythic raids. If anything, people do go back to do the old mythic raids for glamour or transmog in World of Warcraft by just massively outgearing the content. In Final Fantasy XIV though, the game is set up for people to go back to do old ultimate raids even if they are non-current. For instance, currently we are in Shadowbringers, ultimate weapon or U-Corp is something that was launched in the previous expansion, but you can definitely go back to experience the fight as it was intended. And yes, to the purist in the room, I know it's not exactly how it was to do you.
I love that he has to say this, because every fucking Andy that killed this boss in Stormsblood will be like, yeah, Grad Center UCOB clear, in parentheses, it was harder back then. Yeah, I'm actually glad. Yeah, dude. Holy shit, that's so good. Absolute weirdos.
Or ultimate weapon on day one due to
Unless
how
you're
downscaling
memeing.
works.
If you're serious, you're a
but
fucking
you're
weirdo
still
bad.
at least given the option to downsync close to the intended player power level when the content is current. In WoW, there's no such options. Which is why in World of Warcraft, you tend to miss out on amazingly good content if you join the MMO in a later stage. And I think the ability to replay old raids as it was intended adds massively to the longevity of the game and stuff to do in Final Fantasy XIV. And I'm grateful that the development team actually offered the option to do so. Next, I'd like to talk about the barrier to entry and the effort to maintaining a raiding tune for raiding in both games.
This is not even close. Now, I'm interested to hear what he says, but oh my god, is the barrier of entry in WoW. Like, we were talking about doing this, like, having... Like, you could do it the other way. Would you guys like to watch a stream of me watching the top 2 or 3 Final Fantasy statics or streamers make a WoW guild and progress the most current or one of the past WoW raids and, like, see them do it blind? That would be fucking fascinating, but it's impossible. Imagine getting people to commit to, like, a 1-month gear up thing instead of what we did, which was basically we, like, hit max level, got traded gear, and could zone in. Impossible. The, like, grind, it's not even like a grind. It used to be way more grindy. It's more like just every patch has so many systems you have to get caught up in. It's just way too convoluted. It's just really not attractive to a new player to go through that.
In recent years, this is not even a contest. World of Warcraft has a way higher barrier to mythic raiding than Final Fantasy XIV has for ultimate raids, in terms of the prep work that you need. Let me explain. In FF14, all you need to do to prep for ultimates is to farm your BIS gear or best in slot gear on your character in every slot. And these are mostly from Savage raids, which by the way has bad luck protection by dropping you tokens that you can use to exchange for gear at vendors if you don't happen to get the loot from the boss you just killed. So with time, you are definitely guaranteed your BIS. There's no question about it as long as you keep farming away. To recap, all you have to do is do PvE raid content, maybe some dungeons, and you get the BIS in every slot, and on top of that, you have bad luck protection. In WoW, firstly, you need to work towards getting your BIS gear from heroic raids and Mythic Plus dungeons before you even step into Mythic Raid. Obviously, if you don't, you won't meet DPS checks in Mythic Raiding, or you won't even have the stamina or health pool to survive AoE attacks. But so far, heroic raids and Mythic Plus dungeon does sound fairly familiar and similar to the work needed for Final Fantasy XIV, and I agree with your assessment. But World of Warcraft has a very big chunk of its player power tied to external systems.
This is not a very flattering pause, but I'm circling your face because you're right. Yeah, all facts, no printer. WoW's biggest problem is they create so much shit in the game that is potentially cool, but when you make it required, it becomes a chore and people don't want to do it. Torghast, prime example. Right, like we talked about potentially adding harder dungeons in Final Fantasy and talked about it a lot and how that would be cool. And you know the first thing that would not make it cool if it was required for player power? If it was something you could do for fun and for an achievement or a mount or something, it'd be great. If they made it required or player power, it would be dog shit. And people would hate it, especially the Final Fantasy community. So, like, dude, if you do dungeons and you've seen some of those dungeon bosses, they're pretty unique, very cool. It's almost like they're begging to be iterated on in a harder form. But man, if they did that, it's like Palace of the Dead, right? Guys, the Palace of the Dead thing is very similar to Torghast and WoW, right? Imagine if you had to do Palace of the Dead every week for some currency. You were just forced to do it. I actually bet it would be disliked and maybe less people would do it. That's exactly what Torghast is in WoW.
These are things that exist beyond your gear slots. For example, in the Shadowlands, we have Covenants and Soulbinds. Think of them as external talent trees that you need to maintain and progress by doing various weeklies and dailies and repeatable quests. And I've not mentioned Torghast, which is a very tedious, repeatable weekly thing that you need to do that people have dubbed Chorghast, but it must be done in order to unlock your best in slot legendary. But back to external systems. In BFA, we had knack essences that require you to grind reputation by doing dailies and weeklies.
Essences were sick. They weren't account-wide for a while, but Essences legit saved that expansion.
To gain certain passives and active abilities on top of your basic class toolkit. And in BFA, we also had corruptions that again grant you certain passive buffs and random proc abilities beyond your basic class toolkit. Furthermore, a lot of these external systems are time-gated. Example, by week X, you can only unlock roll 4 of your external system, and you need to wait until week Y to get roll 5. There's just no artificial gates like that in Final Fantasy XIV. And I will add that these external systems are actually mandatory. It's a huge chunk of your output, so you shouldn't be missing out on them. And this is why in WoW, the barrier to entry and maintaining a raiding toon is way higher. It takes substantially way more work to get your character in a state for the toughest endgame raiding in WoW versus Final Fantasy XIV. In short, I hope this was...
Yep, time gating is dog shit. This is a good video. I like this guy's takes. I don't know if I've watched any of his content before, but very smart.